Okay, hello and welcome back. This is the week one lecture. So today we'll be talking about Stranger Than Paradise, directed by Jim Jarmusch. Came out originally in 1984. So this is where we start our tour of American independent cinema. And like I was saying in the introductory lecture, we're not exactly at the very beginning of independent film production in America, but we're not too far off. I mean, we sort of located the beginning of American independent film back in the 1960s with John Cassavetes and some of the films that he made after he created his own distribution company so he could produce his films independently and distribute them independently outside of that Hollywood power structure that he, of course, was involved in. He worked for Hollywood as an actor and then used that money to finance his own films. And then we had other indie filmmakers crop up throughout the 70s into the early 80s. But we're still in the early stages here as we begin in 1984, the year of my birth, coincidentally. So Jarmusch is an important figure. He's an inspiration for a lot of later filmmakers who come along, in large part because of his visual style and the sort of do-it-yourself approach that he and this film really epitomize. So Pearson lays out some reasons why this film was successful, talks a little bit about some of Jarmusch's influences, and I think this is a good place to start, not only because of the sort of historical importance of the film, but also this is a good introduction to a lot of what we're going to be dealing with in this class. This is an avant-garde film. It's strange. Not a whole lot of action really occurs. We're going to notice right away that we're pretty far removed from a lot of the touchstones of mainstream, big budget, big studio Hollywood filmmaking. Jarmusch isn't interested in hitting a lot of those notes and making that kind of a film. So we exist in a different world here, whether we're talking about acting, cinematography. We're going to notice the black and white color scheme, which is also a little bit different, perhaps a little bit unusual for a lot of modern film viewers. The pacing of the film might take a little getting used to. It's a little bit slow moving, frankly, at times. But this is really a character study. So we need to get interested in the characters. We need to think about the characters. We can think about setting. We can think about a lot of those familiar literary elements. But I also want to talk about a few reasons why Jarmusch has proven to be influential. And again, that has a lot to do with visuals and other cinematic techniques. And also Jarmusch, like I've said before, follows a trajectory that we're going to get very familiar with in this class. He directs some low-budget independent films early in his career, gets critical recognition, maybe not a ton of popular acclaim, but he is noticed by critics, scholars. Then later he gets a chance to make bigger budget movies for major studios with kind of mixed results. He's still not famous, in a really mainstream way. A lot of movie nerds know who he is, but he has transitioned into making slightly more mainstream movies starring the likes of Johnny Depp, Bill Murray, Adam Driver, Tilda Swinton. So when I talk about Jarmusch with people, oftentimes a lot of sort of casual filmgoers aren't familiar with his early work, his sort of underground indie work, really illustrated well by Stranger Than Paradise, but they might be a little bit more familiar with some of the stuff that he did later. So Stranger Than Paradise was his second film. His first came out in 1980. It was called Permanent Vacation. It didn't make a huge impact, but as Pearson discusses in I think the second chapter of the book, Stranger Than Paradise was at least a hit with critics. It never made a whole lot of money, but it was a success, and it paved the way for Jarmusch to do a bunch of other films throughout the 80s into the 90s. He did a great one in 1989 called Mystery Train. Prior to that, Down by Law. Those are celebrated by critics. Into the 90s, he started doing some bigger projects, Ghost Dog, Way of the Samurai with Forrest Whitaker. Also, he did Dead Man. I believe that was a little bit later in the 90s, starring Johnny Depp. And some people are familiar with his stuff from the 2000s. In 2004, he directed Coffee and Cigarettes. That kind of was a success. He did Broken Flowers in 2005 with Bill Murray. In 2013, he directed Only Lovers Left Alive. That was starring Tom Hiddleston and Tilda Swinton. He did Patterson in 2016, starring Adam Driver. And most recently, he did The Dead Don't Die in 2019, also with Adam Driver. And I believe Bill Murray was in that as well. So again, he's turned a little bit more mainstream, but he's always been a quirky, offbeat filmmaker. He's not really interested in a lot of like conventional action, a lot of the conventional markers of big Hollywood movies. A lot of his films are considered to be comedies, including this one, even though they might not always be laugh out loud funny. There are a lot of comedic elements that we can detect. So Pearson talks a little bit about the initial reception of the film and also its kind of production history. So it started out as simply a one-act short film. It was only about a half hour long, and it just consisted of what is now the first act of the movie, pretty much everything that happens in New York. So we have a really crisp, clean, three-part structure. Kind of traditional in a way. Again, Jarmusch is very unconventional in a lot of ways, but the structure of his story really owes a lot to like classical theater. It's a really traditional three-act structure. And it's all kind of determined by geography. The first act is in New York City, the second act is in Cleveland, and then the third act is down in Florida. But originally it was a short film, only 30 minutes long, and Jarmusch didn't initially have enough money to do anything else. He was able to expand it by getting some funding from European sources. He was able to eventually finish it. And it debuted at a few film festivals in '84. It played at the Cannes Film Festival in France. Was a big hit there. I believe Jarmusch won the Golden Camera Prize for Best New Director at that film festival. And then later, it ended up making pretty good money considering how low budget it was. So it ended up grossing about $2.5 million in America. That's nothing for a big budget, big studio film. But when you consider that Jarmusch made Stranger Than Paradise for around $110,000, $2.5 million gross, that's good. That's good. So in addition to making some money and sort of establishing himself as an up-and-coming filmmaker, again, he also influenced a lot of future filmmakers. So Pearson talks about some of the reasons why this movie was so influential. And we have to start with the cheap budget. I already mentioned $110,000. That still seems like a lot of money for me, but that's not a lot of money when it comes to actually making a movie. So again, that's the sort of do-it-yourself approach that we often see with independent film production, especially back in the 80s. And back in these early days. Again, things have opened up. The studios don't control everything anymore. But if you're going to finance your own film production, you're going to probably max out some credit cards, or you're going to have to rely on maybe your savings, family money, if you have any. And then in the case of Jarmusch, you might have to find investors, sometimes outside of the country, who are willing to put some money towards the production. expecting some return on their investment. So then, of course, you have to hope that the movie makes some money so you'll be able to repay those people who helped make the production of the film possible. So again, the sort of DIY approach and stretching a small budget and making the most of it, that was sort of a good example for other filmmakers to follow. Also, Jarmusch cast non-professional actors. So when we're thinking about acting in this film, a lot of people think it's very naturalistic, it's very realistic, and some will claim that the reason for that is, the actors are kind of just playing versions of themselves. They're not professional actors, so that kind of brings a different quality to the film. So we have John Lurie in the sort of main role. He's our protagonist. He was a musician at the time, lived in New York. I think Jarmusch knew him sort of socially. Later on, Lurie would become more of an actor. I'm not sure if he ever considered himself an actor first and foremost. He would appear in some pretty well-known films later in the 80s and into the 90s, like The Last Temptation of Christ, Paris, Texas. But he's still probably better known as a visual artist and a musician. So he played in a lot of bands in New York. That's probably how Jarmusch first met him. And then also Richard Edson, who plays his friend in the film. Edson would also go on to become an actor, but he was a musician originally, and at this point had not really acted very much. But largely on the strength of this performance, he would get cast in other indie films. Later, he's going to show up in some of Spike Lee's movies. He showed up in the famous Vietnam film Platoon, which came out in 1986, directed by Oliver Stone. So Edson becomes a somewhat recognizable character actor in large part because of this film. And then the final key performance to consider here, we don't have a lot of characters, really just 3, unless we count Aunt Lottie. But our final role our final main role is filled by Esther Balint, who is actually a Hungarian musician and avant-garde theater performer who had recently come to New York. And again, later she would appear in more mainstream sort of stuff. I mean, she was like a guest star on an episode of Miami Vice at some point. She appeared in some other films. She would later appear in some other Jarmusch films. But again, not first and foremost thought of as an actor, more thought of as a musician and as sort of, like I said, more of like a theater performer, but not sort of a traditional sort of acting type thing, more avant-garde performance. So those are our 3 leads, and like Pearson says, they're kind of, riffing on their own real life personalities. As he says, the 3 of them were the characters and the characters were them. So this is another way that Jarmusch kind of puts his own unique stamp on this film. He's going outside the Screen Actors Guild to find actors. These are not polished professional actors. And I think that the effect that the non-professional acting creates really works well with the sort of gritty atmosphere, the black and white photography. It all works well together. So let's talk about that visual style that we can clearly see here. And again, Jarmusch has his own style, and it does evolve over time, but this is a good representation of his style as it existed in his early films. So the movie was shot, the cinematographer of the film was Tom DeCillo. And he's kind of an important guy in his own right. He would later go on to direct some pretty well-known independent films of his own. But here he was working as the cinematographer. He also makes an appearance towards the end of the movie. He plays the ticket agent at the Florida airport. You might catch him. Again, they were kind of short on money, so they needed to fill some of those smaller roles with people who would not require additional payment. So DeCillo is responsible for the camera work And if you pay attention, I mean, the first thing that's going to strike us here is probably the fact that there are a lot of stationary camera shots here, and there are a lot of long-lasting shots. So those are two things that we can definitely notice about Jarmusch's visual style. He does often use a stationary camera, right? So we don't have a lot of movement, right? We're just sort of setting the camera up, and then we are observing what happens between the characters. Often they're having a conversation, or they might just be sort of sitting around and not really talking very much. But yeah, we often get a stationary camera, and a lot of the individual shots are going to feel a little bit long. They are longer than what we might often see in mainstream sort of contemporary Hollywood film. So that might lead some people to label the visual style perhaps a little bit boring, or maybe slow moving would be a more generous way of putting it. And yeah, that's not, I mean, I wouldn't say it's boring, but you can point out that, you know, the long shots, the long duration, you know, the stationary camera, it can sometimes be, it can make us feel a little bit antsy, or it might make us feel a little bit trapped or a little bit stuck, both literally and perhaps figuratively. But those might all be very important emotions for us to feel, because they might put us in better mind of what the characters are feeling and what the characters are going through and what life is like for the three main characters in the film. So, you know, again, that's always what we want to do when we're making observations or when we're conducting analysis of visual elements. We always want to tie the visual stuff to whatever we think the larger theme might be, or the larger mood, the larger feelings that we're supposed to be picking up on as viewers. Again, the lighting, the camera work, the mise-en-scene, all of that contributes. So that's a way to tie everything together. Yeah, so Jarmusch himself, he's not really a visual virtuoso. His background was more in lit. Like, he went to Columbia in New York City. He went to Columbia University to study literature. He's originally from Ohio. And then after his undergraduate days, he does go on to film school at NYU. But some people described his visual aesthetic as kind of simple or primitive, or just very straightforward. And again, that had a certain appeal because it's easier to pull off, and it's a little bit cheaper in many ways when it comes to production costs. So think about it. If you don't have a ton of different shots, and if your camera isn't moving very much, that means you need fewer camera setups. You need fewer pieces of equipment. Maybe you don't need a whole lot of dolly shots. You're not doing a whole lot of tracking. You're not doing a whole lot of panning or tilting. So that means fewer setups, less need for equipment. You might need a little bit less manpower, fewer grips to pay. And that all helps when you're working on a tight budget. So again, there's a simplicity, there's almost a kind of minimalism that we might feel at times with the visuals. That really spoke to aspiring filmmakers who maybe didn't have a ton of money. Maybe they didn't go to film school. Maybe they hadn't acquired a really sophisticated level of knowledge about camera movement, different kinds of shots. So this was a style that felt accessible. It felt like, people could do it. It was within reach. So there's a great quote from Kevin Smith, a director we're going to be talking about later in the semester, when he's talking about the influence of Jarmusch, and he's talking about that visual style. And he says, you watch Jarmusch's movies and you think, man, I could really make a movie. Even though I don't have a lot of money, even though I don't have a lot of equipment, even though I might not have a really sophisticated visual sense, I can still make a movie. Set up the camera and let's see what happens. However, so that's the common perception of Jarmusch's visual style, and there's a lot of truth to it. However, I do just want to return to Tom DeCillo, our cinematographer, for just a moment, because DeCillo's really good. And I think if we dismiss Jarmusch's visual style as like primitive or super simplistic, we kind of unintentionally, commit an injustice to DeCillo, because his sense of framing is really exquisite. So yeah, there's not a ton of movement, although there is some. But I want you guys to notice the framing of individual shots, the way he uses doorways and other aspects of physical space to give a shape, to give a height and a width to the shots, to dictate field of vision, dictate what we see. His framing is really good, and it's not accurate to say that his camera never moves. Sometimes it does. There's that pretty well-known tracking shot of Ava when she first arrives in New York City, and we sort of follow her as she walks down the street. That's a great example of a tracking shot, and it doesn't just capture the music and the character, it also tells us a lot about our setting. We should be interested in the setting here. We're in New York City, a city that maybe some of us have visited. We're at least all familiar with it. We've seen it depicted in some movie or some TV show before. But the New York City of Stranger Than Paradise is not the New York City that exists today. We're going back in time. We're going back to the 80s, when there were still a lot of parts of the city that were, frankly, in sort of disrepair. There was a lot of crime, a lot of what was called urban decay or urban blight, kind of a desolated sort of feeling, a lot of abandoned buildings, a lot of areas that look a little bit downtrodden, a little bit run down. Now, of course, gentrification was already starting in earnest by that point, but it just took some time for it to really start to change and remake the city. But of course it did. And now if you go to like the Lower East Side in New York, where Pearson and Jarmusch used to hang out and go to shows and talk about movies, it doesn't look like it did back in their day, right? It's been cleaned up, it's been made a lot safer for tourists and all of that. But we're going back to a previous time when there was sort of this sense of decay, desolation, almost isolation at times. And that seems to have an effect on the characters, right? Because they want to get out, they want to go somewhere else. Their lives feel maybe a little bit stuck. They might feel a little bit confined, a little bit limited in terms of their options. And a lot of that has to do with the actual setting, the actual location of this story. And the camera work will tell us a lot about where we are, what it feels like to be in this place, what it looks like, what it feels like, and how it might affect the characters. So again, give a little bit of love to Tom DeCillo. He's a good cinematographer. He would go on to direct films of his own, including one called Living in Oblivion that came out later in the 90s, starring Steve Buscemi, and it's about an independent film getting made in all of its messy glory. So DeCillo kind of went on to have a pretty good career of his own. So he's a big part of this film and the look and the feel of this film. But also there's some other recurring characteristics of Jarmusch's films that we can see here. A carefully orchestrated soundtrack. So if you're interested in music, you definitely want to talk about John Lurie, who, in addition to playing the lead role, was also in charge of the film's music. Now remember, he is a musician himself, so he's probably well qualified to do that work. Also, what's often described as a sort of deadpan comic style. Again, a lot of Jarmusch's films are categorized as comedies. Sometimes people dispute that. I would say most of his films are pretty funny. Generally speaking, they're not always laugh out loud or over the top funny. They don't usually feature a lot of like slapstick or like obvious punchlines, but instead there's a lot of irony, and there's what's sometimes called deadpan, which means sort of is very underplayed, right? We don't have exaggerated facial expressions. We don't have a lot of stuff that's loud and showy. Instead, we have a lot of maybe verbal irony. We have a sort of understated, wry, offbeat sort of comic style that surfaces in a lot of other films directed by Jarmusch. Again, urban locations, urban settings that often seem very desolate. That's a recurring sort of motif. If you watch Patterson, which came out just about 6 years ago, is sort of a somewhat similar physical location, even though it's a much different time period. So we get a lot of urban settings. We have dialogue that's often very sparse. And Jarmusch usually writes his own screenplays. So again, some people think of him a little bit as an auteur. He writes and directs. He kind of has a lit and writing background. But we notice that his characters don't always necessarily talk a lot. But sometimes the things that they do say can be pretty funny. And sometimes their lack of talking, the silent spaces, can be a little bit funny in ways as well. And there's also this sense of ennui. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that term. It may have come up in a previous lit class. It's often associated with the novel Madame Bovary. That's kind of the book that gave birth to the modern concept. It's just this general sort of feeling of listlessness and dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction with your life, feeling kind of lethargic, you lack energy, you lack inspiration, you feel kind of alienated in some ways. And I think the characters all very much fit that bill. Again, though they are labeled as comedies, a lot of Jarmusch's films, and this one's a good example, strike me as a little bit sad and wistful in some ways. And again, part of that has to do with DeCillo's camera work and maybe even some editing techniques. So not only do we have long takes, right, shots that last a long time, but we also have slow fades to black. That's often how shots or scenes will end. And I think the combination of that stationary camera, the long-lasting shots, and those slow fades to black, they really help to capture a lot of the ennui and frustration being felt by the characters. You know, there's this sense of kind of ambivalence. They're not quite sure what they're looking for. They're not quite sure, you know, the larger purpose of these travels. They just know that whatever it is that they're looking for, they're not finding it. They haven't found it yet. So, you know, there's a lot of ways that that's expressed both through dialogue, through the things that the characters are saying, but it can also be expressed through music. It can be expressed through lighting. It can be very much expressed through camera work. So definitely think about that. There's always these sort of small, like inspired touches in a lot of Jarmusch's movies that I think you can always pick out. Little details, maybe small roles, characters that show up and make a big impression. To me, a good example of that in this film is Aunt Lottie. Aunt Lottie shows up during Act 2 when they've gone to Cleveland. Willie, Eddie, and Ava have gone to Cleveland to visit Willie's aunt and to stay with her. And this is probably the closest we get to maybe like mainstream sort of conventional comedy. So Aunt Lottie has kind of a funny accent. She's a Hungarian immigrant. We could do a lot with Willie's Hungarian identity, right? He's sort of hiding from it, running from it. He very much wants to be an American, doesn't like to talk about where he comes from. But at the same time, we can see this level of cultural knowledge that he still possesses. He's still willing to go and stay with Lottie, at least take advantage of a free place to stay. So yeah, there's that whole push and pull with his like cultural heritage. That's a whole thing that you could get into if you're interested in the character of Willie as portrayed by John Lurie. I think Lurie's great in that role. He really has the right combination of a sort of cool effect, but also kind of desperate, lonely, very much alienated. And again, his complicated relationship to his own family and his own cultural background sort of illustrate this kind of like feeling he has maybe of not really belonging anywhere, not having sort of stable roots anywhere. But anyway, when they're staying with Aunt Lottie, we get some kind of conventional comedy, right? Her accent's kind of funny, and I always think about the scene where she's playing cards with the boys, and she's obviously beaten them several times. She wins again, says, "I am the winner." In her accent, Eddie points out that she's won like 3 times in a row. And I just love her line of dialogue in response to that. She says, "I am lucky in card. I win every time." So that makes me laugh. I don't know if you guys find it funny, but it's just a nice touch, right? It tells us a lot about Willie. It tells us a lot about his family, their sort of immigrant experience. But Aunt Lottie's just a fun character in her own right, and even though she's only on screen for a short period of time, she kind of steals the scenes that she's in. Another moment that I always pick out as just sort of a good representation of like what the film does well and how it does deliver some comedy even in the midst of all that ennui. A little bit earlier, if you remember, Willie and Eddie accompany Eva and her like quasi boyfriend to the movies. Not coincidental that they go to a movie theater. But notice just little things like Eddie sits in between the couple and he takes some popcorn for himself. He seems a little interested in Ava. That could be part of it. But also we just realize, and this scene drives it home, that Willie and Eddie are just really hustlers, right? We already know that. We saw them pulling the scam with the card game, right? And that's also part of the reason they want to get out of New York, probably. They've kind of run afoul of maybe some wrong people. But this is just another example, right? Because as the boy, Billy or whatever, as he's leaving, Eddie thanks him for, quote, paying for us too. So that's just another nice comic touch. The kind that Jarmusch often includes in his scripts, but it also says a lot about the characters. Says a lot about Willie and Eddie. They really are hustlers through and through. So just to kind of summarize, if we're talking about the influence here that Jarmusch has, again, think about the low budget, think about the DIY approach, think about a visual style that we could call simple. At the very least, it's sort of austere. It's a little bit bare bones. It's not flashy. It's not always premised on a ton of excitement and movement. But again, these characters' lives aren't super exciting. There's a lot of static qualities to their lives, and that might lend itself to the visual style. There's also the comic sensibility that, again, takes a little bit of getting used to. Not everybody thinks Jarmusch is funny, and not everybody really appreciates his style or his tone. So you kind of have to work at it a little bit, let it wash over you, and you might not even fully appreciate it until you've finished the film. But there is a comic sensibility here, so look for it. Also, he was importing certain stylistic techniques and certain kind of moves that he makes from European art cinema, from the French New Wave. Some of you might have heard that term before. A lot of American filmmakers were influenced by the French New Wave. That was a bunch of French directors really beginning after World War II, but in earnest during the 50s and 60s. Many of those French directors influenced by earlier Hollywood films, but they were making very innovative, exciting, sort of experimental in some ways movies that made their way over to America. Again, they were showing in those repertory kinds of theaters that Pearson talks about in Chapter 1, and young independent filmmakers like Jarmusch, they went and watched those movies. They enjoyed those movies. So the black and white photography, certain other things that we can find in the cinematography and the blocking, the way actors move, set design, and also the script. the screenplay that Jarmusch wrote. All of it is a little bit influenced by European art cinema, particularly those French films. And again, we know from Pearson that European art cinema was a big deal in the 1980s New York City underground film world. So those influences would have been pretty clear. Also, he's always been good at casting his movies. He's always found the right actors for his characters, and he's doing that here even with non-professional actors. But remember, Lurie, Balint, and Edson all go on to act more. So clearly, Jarmusch saw something in them that other directors and future producers and casting directors would also see. And the idea that technical virtuosity for a director was not necessarily a prerequisite for success. That's another influential aspect of this film. Again, DeCillo had a good knack for framing and a little bit of movement and capturing things in a unique way. But Jarmusch kind of sets the stage for Kevin Smith and other directors that we'll see that maybe didn't have a real strong visual flair of their own, but they had a sense of how they wanted their movies to look. And then they might either employ good cinematographers or just kind of do it themselves. But like Smith says in the book, there's something to be said for just setting up the camera and letting things happen. It feels real, it feels organic, it feels sort of vital and fresh in a way. And I think that's why people responded well to Stranger Than Paradise. And then about 10 years later, they would respond well to Clerks, directed by Kevin Smith. We'll watch that film eventually. It's also in black and white. It also has a lot of stationary camera, not a lot of movement, a lot of deadpan humor. So when we watch Smith, we can definitely see the ways that he's been influenced by Jarmusch. So that's another thing that we'll do throughout the semester, kind of track influences, see how some of the early indie directors that we watch do have a big impact on some of the later ones. But we will also notice that as the semester progresses, our films get a little bit more mainstream. And that's just the evolution or the progression of American independent cinema. Not to say that weird stuff doesn't still get made. But in '84, independent film usually was weird. It usually was avant-garde and very different from the mainstream, like Stranger Than Paradise. So we're going to track how that changes a little bit, how the definitions and the expectations for independent film expand. Budgets get bigger, business models change, and before long, a lot of indie films don't look all that different from maybe big budget mainstream films. But we'll cover that later. But I like to start with something very weird, very different, so we can see kind of where independent film was in the 80s during these early stages. There's a lot you could work with this movie. I would encourage you to think a little bit about the song that we hear repeatedly, I Put a Spell on You, by Screamin' Jay Hawkins, an old blues musician. That seems to have importance on multiple levels. Also think about where we are, the different locations. New York City, Cleveland, and then we end up in Florida. We have multiple bodies of water. Lake Erie in Cleveland, and the ocean, I assume, the Atlantic Ocean in Florida. So you can think about geography, you can think about water, you can think about seasons. What is the impact of winter? The cold, the snow, what impact does that have? There's a really great shot on the snowy train tracks in Cleveland where we see Willie and Eddie talking while they're still at Aunt Lottie's house. And again, just sort of sums up the ennui and the frustration of the film. I think it's Eddie talking. And he says, it's funny, you come to someplace new and everything just looks the same. So that line of dialogue is doing a lot. It has to do with their present situation, but it seems to speak a lot to the larger themes and meanings of the film, but also think about the different places they go and think about how they look, because that also matters. I'll just sum it up by calling it maybe a slice of life realism that's been expertly crafted and packaged. That's one final thing we can consider, the realism of the film. Does it feel real? People call it gritty, people have called it grimy, but a lot of people call it real. It seems authentic. It seems organic. So again, let's explore the reasons why. If we agree that it does feel realistic, let's try to figure out why, and then let's try to figure out why it's a good thing to be realistic. Some movies are, some movies aren't. But of course, with small budgets and a smaller scope, a lot of independent films from this period and beyond were thought of as maybe being able to capture something close to real life by getting really close to these small everyday details. There's not going to be enough money for aliens and explosions and huge, action scenes. So we have a smaller focus on everyday life. Again, that's not always the case with indie films, but it was often thought of as being something that indie films did throughout the 80s and the 90s. So do we see that here with Stranger Than Paradise? Is this a slice of life, a realistic portrait of three people who are kind of just floating on the margins of society, who don't really seem to know where they fit? Also, we can think about set design, think about Willie's apartment, think about Aunt Lottie's house. A lot of good stuff you can do there if you're considering mise-en-scene. And again, with black and white movies, we can always think about lighting, contrast, shadows. There's always fun stuff we can do with that as well. Okay, so that's it for week one. I hope to see everybody active on the discussion board, and just make it a habit to watch these lectures each week. I know they can be a little bit time consuming, but I'll try to keep them as brief and fun as possible. And it's usually a good idea to watch the movie, as you can probably tell, watch the movie first, arrive at your own conclusions, and then watch my lecture for some further reinforcement. Okay, so I will see you guys next week as we check out Parting Glances.